Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar with Tokyo Cement. Our host will be Mr. Praveen Yanam, Director Innovations, and Mr. Ajit Herath, General Manager Finance at Tokyo Cement. Welcome both. So before getting into the sessions, audience, we'd like to briefly inform that these sessions we will break into two. During the initial phase, we'll be discussing the management to get an understanding about the company and its outlook. Then the final phase, when you pose the questions, we'll be asking it to the management and we'll have a discussion around that. So to start off, Mr. Praveen, when we look at the performance of Tokyo Cement, it has performed exceptionally well in full year 21. But that performance didn't last long, as we saw a sharp decline in first half of full year 2022. So can you shed some light on this?
Sure. So when you look at FY 2021, so in Q1 2020, of course, we had lockdowns and travel restrictions, all those other things. So those were something that affected sales volume and so on. But then when you had Q2 and Q3, things were opening up a little bit. There was consumption. And during that period, we were able to import raw materials with ease. We didn't really have any LC issues or import sort of issues on that basis. And we were able to run our plants almost at maximum capacity utilization. The other thing that contributed to that was that there were import restrictions that allowed us to gain considerable market share and allow us to service market largely with locally produced cement rather than also a mix of bulk imported cement, which reduces our profitability. Then what we saw was over the course of 2020 calendar year, we saw all the global raw material prices rise at a considerable rate. Freight costs exploded with bulk freight going to about 300% what it was in 2019. And so the impact of these cost increases, of course, affected our cost of goods. And it was compounded by rupee depreciation. So at that time, we were unable to adjust our price due to the price ceiling being immovable despite our requests. So we had to take losses at that period due to macro factors and policy constraints. But from October of that year onwards, we were able to adjust our prices accordingly.
Okay, so now when you look at the latest financial, like you can see drastic improvement in the performance. I think the major reason for this is cap removal on the selling price. So can we expect Tokyo to maintain consistent earnings going forward?
I mean, yeah, well, historically, and I've been saying this a lot, Tokyo Cement has been stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rock has been currency depreciation that just keeps squeezing us, and the hard place being the mandated MRP. So we were never allowed historically to adjust cost increases or depreciation without going through a long process. And during that process, we'd be forced to make losses. So in this current situation, we're able to adjust our pricing in line with global costs, and just like any other business, which was a luxury we never had. However, with that in mind, current operating environment is extremely fluid and uncertain. There's a lot of delays in establishing LCs. Cost increases are still the trend at the moment.
I think we have lost Mr. Praveen at the moment. It could be due to technical reasons. Ajit, you also see the same issues, or? Hi, Mr. Praveer. I think we have lost you. So if you can kindly repeat it, I think would be helpful.
Sure. Where did I get lost?
So I think you have mentioned about the current environment is not like really favorable. So I think that is really
So, I
you
mean,
said like
we're able to adjust according to global conditions. But in the current situation, we're still saddled with the fact that there's a lot of delays in establishing LCs. And those delays in establishing LCs mean that we have shortages in raw materials being shipped on time to be produced on time. So, and then of course, costing costs are still trending upwards. So global costs. So we'll be adjusting as necessary. But if the forex shortage is rectified, then that would allow us to perform consistently.
so I think you have mentioned about these LC issues. That so many investors also had concerns with the disclosure made in the latest financial. So this question is to Mr. Ajit, right? So when we look at this disclosure, we can see some provisions made for the potential FX loss if currency depreciates to 230. So can you shed some light on this? Like what kind of loss we should expect? Is this loss capped at 1 billion, or can this exceed beyond 1 billion?
Yes, this according to Sri Lanka accounting standards, we can't provide this amount. So whatever the amounts we have to recognize up to LKR at 203, US dollar at LKR 203. So therefore, we have estimated the possible liability at 220 and 230. So this is just a disclosure. This might change according to the dollar liability that would be at a given reporting date. So at the moment, this amount has not been provided in the financial statement. It's just a disclosure for anybody to get an idea.
Okay. So given the fact that the MRP, there is no cap at the moment, aren't you in a position to pass this cost escalation?
I mean, within reason, there's still an affordability consideration, and we also don't want to open up the market for everyone to rush in. There's also the fact that we've been under MRP for a long time. It's not something where like we're going to abuse just because we can. Because if you look at other construction materials, right, ever since they put in the import restrictions on tiles, it's gone up by 100% at least. If you look at copper wires, things like that, that's gone by 200%. You look at steel, that's gone up by over 100% in the same period. We went from 1,095 to 1,275 and now 1,375. That in 3 years, right? So that's a 26% increase in that period of time. We're still going to be consumer focused. We're not going to, sort of take advantage of the situation. We're still going to do it within certain spaces. So if the currency depreciates, we have to adjust our prices. But at this point, we can't really do much.
Okay. So on the other hand, now when we look at the performance of first half of full year 22, we saw sudden rise in the distribution cost. Can you please explain our audience the reason for a sharp rise in distribution cost?
Yeah, so that's something that came up. So you're mostly looking at the comparison between Q1 FY 2022 versus Q1 FY 2021. A large part of that is situational. So in 2020, that specific quarter, there was no real distribution taking place because there was a full lockdown for the majority of that quarter. So the actual growth in distribution seemed phenomenal because of that. Another thing that happened in that Q1 of last year was that there were travel restrictions, which is very different to a lockdown. During travel restrictions, we take on the distribution costs because we're the BOI company with the infrastructure. So our distributors aren't actually, using their trucks or anything like that, just simply because they can't. There's restrictions on where they can go, and particularly inter-province and stuff like that. So we took on a lot of costs that our distributors previously had. Of course, there are some of these things that have increased permanently. That's because of fuel increases, lorry rental increases, and also driver charges have all gone up in that period of time. So,
So now, with the easing of lockdown, can we expect this distribution cost to gradually come down? I think we have noted that sign in the latest financial, but can we expect this trend to continue?
it's a bit early to say. I mean, like I said, despite that situational thing, there are other cost increases that have just gone up. Fuel, lorry, rental, because there's no vehicles either, right, in the market. So access to vehicles and everything, and access to and the driver charges have gone up. We would, of course, work towards trending it down as much as we can.
Okay, so let's shift our focus towards the industry dynamics, right? So the industry dynamics looks favorable. We are having a lower interest environment. But on the other hand, there's a concern with the investors whether new entrants like Lanka can capture the market share from Tokyo Cement. So what's your thought on this?
So I think these are two separate questions. So let's look at the favorability of the economic environment. So yes, you're right. Interest rates trending down typically do lead to greater sort of construction-based investment. We saw it in 2015 and 2016 as a result of the interest rates that preceded it. However, there are other considerations such as inflation. As I mentioned, steel going up by 100%, tiles going up by 100%, wiring going up 200%. All of these sort of things create an affordability issue too. So how that affects domestic consumption, we're yet to see, because a lot of that inflation has happened in the last 6 months. As far as new entrants and things like that in the market, I mean, Lanka is setting up a 3 million metric ton plant. We have 3 million. NC has 2.7 million. Most of these plants can only operate at around 85% capacity max. So you look, and then last year the consumption was around 7.1 million metric tons or so. So there is space for all of us to exist. Lanka won't be coming in with 3 million straight away. So in the first year, I think they're running 1 mil. So that might just be 1 million metric tons. But we're already towards the mid part of this quarter. It doesn't seem that they're on track to start this quarter. Their conveyor line from Hambantota port to bring raw materials in is not finished. So let's say they start in Q2, then you're Q2 calendar quarter or Q1 financial quarter. Then you're looking at potentially them able to add about 600,000 to 700,000 metric tons for the year, which there's space for. So we're not particularly worried about them. We also feel that when they do compete, they're going to be competing more with INSEE than with us, because our strengths are typically north, east, central, and some in the western province. INSEE's is largely south and central and west. So we'll have to see.
So do you see, now you have located mainly in east, so do you see any competitive advantage due to your location? Because I think you have mentioned if Lanka to compete, they will first have to compete with INSEE before entering your space. So do you see any competitive advantage due to your location?
I mean, yeah, we're the market leader by a considerable margin in the Northern East. Um, there's the competitive advantage happens to be with the fact that we've invested so much into that area. So, I mean, we have uh, our own jetty for bringing raw materials and, if necessary, for pumping out finished products. Um, we have a large distribution infrastructure. We have a train line. We have, which we don't really use that much, but we have a lot of um, distributors based in the north and east that distribute to a large part of the country. We have depots. We have all that infrastructure that gives us a competitive advantage. Um, we market Nippon cement largely in the north and east, which is an evolution of the Mitsui brand. Um, and that particular market is incredibly brand loyal. Like Nippon is by far the market leader there. Um, and yeah, I believe that our logistics infrastructure and strong distribution network, in particular, would be a considerable barrier to entry for new entrants.
Mhm. And there are other players like Melka, and even we have seen small scale operation from Richard Peary's, right? So now for them to compete with players like you, is what is the like barrier? Is it mainly distribution channel we are looking at, or the locations? Because I think
Um,
for them
Sorry, please.
to penetrate into the for them to for the new players to penetrate into this market, I think they have to reach out through distribution network, right? So in that case, do you have any locked up contract with existing distributors, or it's a straight away for new players to come and attack the existing players in the market?
There are distributor agreements and things like that. There are loyalty programs, all that. I think, if anything, the last 2+ years, the distributors in particular would have come to appreciate the consistency that they get with someone like us, because there are so many brands that entered the market back in 2017 and stuff, import brands. There were way more brands back then than exist now. At one point, that market share probably came up to around 19% of these other small players. Now, all of them cumulatively make up about 6% of the market, because they can't supply. And when you're talking about, for example, rigid periods and things like that, they're either importing bags directly, which is something that's quite expensive, and the distribution limits the sort of the how far you can distribute around the country limits how much margin they can possibly have to grow the operation, or they're doing a bulk OEM. So, for example, PowerTech imports bulk cement and then bags for a lot of other players, um, including, I believe, at one point they did it for Richard Pierce and stuff like that. So then that's just some white labeling that they're doing. So there isn't really any competitive advantages. They're just taking up little bits and pieces of market that are relatively insignificant to us.
Okay, so now when we shift our focus towards this Colombo terminal, you have done some expansion there as well. So can you please explain us like the motive behind this expansion?
So our Colombo terminal was previously had a capacity around 450 to around 600,000 metric tons at its peak. Now with this expansion, we could go to about 1.1 million metric tons. So this is largely a bulk cement importing terminal. The advantage is distribution to the Western province and largely to Colombo, where the majority of consumption happens in the country. Um, there are, smaller margins on importing finished cement, but we intend to consolidate a greater market share, um, and particularly in the highest demand province, which is Western, both through grinding and import operations. So um, it's a market leadership sort of strategy.
Okay. So lastly, I think you have mentioned about potential capacity expansion. So if you can give us a bit understanding about the current utilizations and when we can expect that additional capacity to come into play.
So we're adding 1 million metric tons. We've already started a lot of the groundwork. So we'd be looking at that coming online, hopefully for testing and things like that by the beginning of 2023. So that will bring us up to about 4 million metric tons rated capacity. As far as capacity utilization, theoretically with cement, it's about 85% of the rated capacity. And then at this current stage, we are in the mid 60s. We can do a lot more. The reason that we aren't doing a lot more is simply because of delays in opening LCs, create shortages in clinker arriving on time. So that's the main issue that we have. It's limitations with LCs. Our peak production was Q2 of FY21, and where we had no LC issues, and we were able to go into the high 80s with that. So yeah, the potential and the profitability and everything is certainly greater if we have a higher capacity utilization.
Okay. So I think, as you have mentioned, one of the key risk facing the company is sourcing the raw materials, and still you have to rely on importation. Is that correct? Because, for example, if you look at tiles, I think they can source the material locally, and when it comes to cement, still, majority of the part we have to rely on importation of clinker.
I also import a lot of raw material like chemicals and clays and things like that too, similar to us in clinker. But yeah.
So do you see this LC issue easing in the near future? Because given cement is an essential part of the construction, do you see any positive developments, or still you are
At the
facing?
moment, it seems that prioritization in LC opening is for fuel. The banks are being pushed towards opening LCs for that purpose. So that seems to be what's trying to. So in the short term, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. If they float the currency, it's a controlled float, or I don't know exactly how they'd go about doing it, but only then will we see an inflow of forex necessary for us to be able to open LCs uninhibited.
So we have seen earnings volatility. It could be due to this current FX issues as well. But on the other hand, should we see cement as a cyclical product? Do you have any peak seasons and then slowing
Oh, yeah,
down?
definitely. So Q3 and Q4 are always higher than Q1 and Q2. And there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of projects tend to start in January, and they tend to ramp up. Consumption tends to ramp up in March in order to get a lot done before Aurudu. Q1 is typically a weak quarter because of Aurudu and the other holidays around it. So consumption, of course, decreases. Q2 is a little bit weak because of monsoons typically happening at that point in the Western Province during September, October, and so on. Sorry, in September. It's typically Q3 and Q4 that we see the most amount of consumption.
Okay, great. So
Q4
shifting my focus to the, okay, so moving on to this anti-dumping. So I have read a couple of press articles, and in the annual report also you have mentioned about this a bit seriously. So I think, can you give some idea about like what can be done to reduce this anti-dumping, and is it a major threat faced by the local players in the market?
At this current stage, it's less so than it was when the market was operating a bit more normally. But the first thing you need to do is acknowledge it, that there is a dumping issue. Indian cement exporters have an excess of capacity, and there are periods in which they would have been freighting and selling cement here for less than what it was sold there. That's the definition of dumping. The other thing that was happening was the Indian government was giving dollar incentives for per metric ton that they would export. So that was around $14 or something like that. So what we would recommend is, okay, is of course the cess is there. It's 2 rupees on every kilo of bulk cement imports and 3 rupees of every kilo of bag cement imports. That's a good sort of policy decision. Allows the local manufacturers that might have higher costs than Indian manufacturers to sell in the market and build infrastructure in the market. Of course, import taxes and things can be there, and then finally, like quality standards. Some of these imports don't really meet that sort of quality standard, so those need to be tightened. And then finally, like local manufacturers should be encouraged through policy. We invest in infrastructure. We're self-dependent. Tokyo itself generates its own power, operates its own jetty, all of that sort of stuff. There should be incentives for us to invest in this infrastructure, and there aren't really. And so a friendly business environment would be nice.
So now Lanka is entering. They are also one of the larger players. So do you see it as a positive development for the local industry to reduce this anti-dumping threat going forward?
If Lanka's on, so theoretical capacity, us with 4 million in 2023, Lanka of maybe 3 million in 2023, and INSEE right now 2.8, but they're saying 1 million. They haven't given a timeline for that. We would have sufficient local production capacity that imports would not necessarily be needed. Certainly not bag imports. We can allow for some bulk imports, but I mean, when we get to that stage, I think that the government should look at that opportunity, because the amount of forex savings that they get from locally produced compared to bag imports is considerable.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for your explanation. I hope our audience found it useful. So now we'll move into the second part of the sessions, where we'll be looking at the questions posted by the investors, and we'll try to post it to the management and see whether they can respond to us. So the first one is about the disposable income. So do you feel with the disposable income reducing, will there be a slowdown in demand?
Yeah, that's a sensible assumption. Inflation always has a sort of impact, right? People prioritize expenditure on things that they need to survive rather than on investment. I don't necessarily think it would affect corporate consumption as much. Private sector and institutional sector consumption will continue to a certain degree. And we are seeing projects in that space. It's just whether how much it would affect domestic consumption, particularly the retail consumer. That's the question. So yeah.
So me as a consumer, when I try to get cement, I can't get it. So the follow-up questions on that is like, given the shortage in the market, should we expect significant slowdown in the market? Because there's a shortage in the market, right?
As a result of shortage. Well, one of the things to consider is that right now there's more volumes in the market than there was in 2019 and 18. So the thing is that demand has also increased, largely because of latent consumption and things like that as well. So that's one thing to consider, is that from 2019 to 2021 and now 22, we have seen growth into this quarter. So on that basis, there's more volume being supplied to the market. It's just that the demand is far greater. the other thing that's happening with this sort of shortage is how much of it is due to sort of market conditions. So, for example, we sell to distributors, so does NC, so does everyone else, and distributors typically will sell to retailers that will retail in the country. What's happening now because of the shortage is uh, distributors are holding on to their inventory and selling it directly. So that's why if you go to your typical hardware shop, there might be less availability, or they'll have to put you on a list and stuff like that, while the distributors can sell to you directly. So that's a consideration too. Um, but it comes down to the LCs. Like we can bring in so much more, we can produce so much more if we were able to open our LCs on time. And we are importing finished cement a lot more than we typically would, just because the turnaround's a bit faster than bringing down a clinker shipment. So that's also for the benefit of, trying to deal with this sort of shortage issue.
Okay. Uh, then if we move on to other questions, the audience is asking whether any possibility of MRP being revoked.
I think
The cap.
MRP has already been revoked. The
No,
question is coming
they are
back.
asking whether they will. Yeah.
I really hope not. Um, it's not a useful policy. It didn't make sense as cement was the only construction material that had it. When even now, even though we don't have it, we're increasing prices at the lowest rates of any construction material when you look at it. And I'm saying, like, we've looked at every construction material and we looked at how much they've gone up, and they've all skyrocketed compared to cement. So we still are adjusting accordingly, only without cost increase.
So the third question is about the industry dynamics. So in your view, like what kind of key demand drivers you are seeing for the cement industry? Because you have highlighted about the inflation slowing down the retail demand, but do you see any like major other demand drivers?
Yeah, there is an increase in bulk consumption. So in the same period, I believe, let me just pull it up. So bulk bag has gone from about 18 bulk uh, to 82 bag to I'm sorry, it's gone from 20 bulk 80 bag to 18 bulk and bag. So there is a slight variation there, but still that percentage of bulk is in that 18 to 20% range, which is largely concrete consumption. So for infrastructure projects, roads, there's still 100,000 kilometers of rural roads are being done. The Central Expressway is still being done. There's still some irrigation networks and things like that being done. Um, and then Tokyo Cement is the sole supplier of concrete to BIA Phase 2. We have a plant inside. So that kind of consumption still exists, and that's what we will probably see continuing because there is that sort of expenditure outlined. But yeah, when it comes to domestic consumption, it's still something that we've got to observe for a larger period of time to make a comment on.
Yeah, you have mentioned about this BIA terminal extension project. Can you give us some context into like, what are the steps taken to like, because now from the start to till now, the cost has escalated significantly. So what kind of action plan you have taken to like recover your like investment?
Sorry, I didn't get all of that. It just cut out.
So how's the progression on the BIA terminal extension project? And so far, what are the steps being implemented to recover the investment? How successful would it be upon completion?
It will be completely profitable after completion. We just installed a ready-mix plant there, and then we're supplying to the primary contractor. So yeah, it's something that's largely uninhibited.
Then another questions on the LC. So they're asking whether any preference are given for local manufacturers over cement importers.
Theoretically, yes, but it's dependent on your relationship with the banks. We have a very good relationship with our banks, and so we're able to do that. We also have a good relationship with our suppliers. So because of that, we're able to get the 180 days credit, which a lot of other competitors cannot really get. So when it comes to opening and selling LCs, it's about where they have space in their forex allotment. So it just comes down to if they have the money to spare, the dollars, sorry. Yeah.
So another questions on the clinker side. If the clinker prices increases plus LKR get floated to around 240 level, where the company would try to keep the margin level set.
We can't really comment specifically about where we would try to keep the margins. It's going to be situational. Ajit, do you have anything to comment on that 240? No, you're muted, Ajit.
It is situational, and so at that time only we can see it, because currently also we are deciding upon considering several variables. So if the LKR goes US dollar goes to 440, then we'll have to decide upon again with the required margins.
Okay. There's other questions about INSEE having integrated factory, which allows them to source raw material locally. And whereas Tokyo, you will have to rely on importation of raw materials, and the LC is creating issues there. So do you see it as a major disadvantage for the company?
Oh yeah, NC definitely has an advantage with their own tone plant. The thing is that factory, that the actual kilning capacity is only at around 600 to 800,000 metric tons of clinker kilning. So what they're largely doing with that Putlam factory is that they are producing limestone cement, the Sunstar cement, which has about a 25 to 30% composition of raw limestone, ground raw limestone, not clinker. Raw limestone doesn't really have any bonding properties. So it's not, Sunstar branded cement is not recommended for concreting. It's largely for plastering and block laying. So that's what they're able to do with that. But INSEE does import a lot of clinker. The entire facility in Gaul is completely dependent on imported clinker. So that's something to consider as well. Another thing that NC has to deal with is access of fuels for operating their kilns and things like that. They of course have the eco cycle, which they can use, burning garbage and waste like that. But then there's a coal component and things that they have to consider, which they have to also take in from Trinco Harbor all the way there to input. So there is a little bit more of a sort of logistics issue for them to service Puntland, but it is a huge advantage to have your own limestone reserves.
Okay.
The other thing to consider is NC also has a parent company in Thailand, so they can theoretically do intercompany transfers for raw materials. So they do have that advantage too.
Okay. The other question is about the role Tokyo Cement will be playing in port city development.
The same role as anyone else. We're a material supplier. We have good relationships with all of the large contractors in the country, the Maga, Tudawe, Sankin, all of them, and we do supply all of their ready-mix facilities and everything. We'd also would want to supply concrete for Port City as well. But with Port City, it just becomes a matter of timing when they're ready, when they create the incentives and the legal framework for FDIs to come in to start developing it. And then on top of that, you have to look at the pre-development sort of timeline, approvals, design, all of that. You're looking at a year to 2 years. So when we will actually see Port City kickoff realistically is a long-term viewpoint.
So do you think there will be preference for Lanwa when allocating resources for government infrastructure projects going forward?
Um, I mean, those of you that know about the political affiliation, then yes, I mean, that's highly likely. But there's also going to be a lot of technical requirements. There's going to be a lot of other things too. Lanwa will still have to go a long way to prove itself as a supplier, as a consistent supplier. It's going to take a long time for them to ramp up their full capacity. They're still adding on machinery and components. They're also going to face a lot of issues with opening LCs and things like that as well, and getting raw materials in. So yeah, I believe that they might get some preferential treatment for certain government projects, but I mean, we supply so many of them right now, so there is space.
Another audience is asking about like what are the elements of cement companies have like what are the like raw materials you are importing for cement production in Sri Lanka other than
The
clinker
main
like
ones are clinker and paper. So I mean, there are other raw materials that are used in cement, like, but the main ones, as far as when you're looking at the cost of, it's clinker, and then the other one is paper. So that's a thing that has also gone up a lot in cost this last few years. There's a huge global paper shortage, but luckily we buy out reams and reams of paper in advance and maintain a stock there. So with future planning, we tend to buy out a lot more raw material inputs inventory that we can keep, things without that much of a shelf life, because we know that the cost is still going up.
there's another questions on the pricing. So he says the cement is currently being sold at different prices in the hardware store, and when asked, they are saying about the higher transportation cost. So he is asking whether do you benefit from this or whether hardware owners are benefiting from this.
Yeah, we are actually very strict with our distributors and things like that about um, sort of rogue pricing. It's not something that you can really control. So right now, like, okay, so our locally produced cement is the MRP is 1,375, and bag imports and things like that are going at around 1,575. So those are two of the written down prices that exist in the market. But there's been something that not just like you have like truck drivers themselves deciding that they're going to make a margin on the back because they understand that they are controlling the demand. You have a lot of people that are purchasing and reselling. People using political influence and stuff like that to get their allotment and then reselling too. So you have a lot of that. You have a lot of that kind of activity going on because of a typical sort of supply shortage situation. So we try to discipline as much as possible, and we try to ensure that we're not supplying to parties that are gouging consumers. But sometimes it's not them. Sometimes it's just their employees. We've seen situations where distributors will be shocked to find out that their employees have charged their own friends, the distributors' friends, an extra 200 rupees or something for a bag of transportation, which was never allowed. So yeah, tends to be there's a lot of power for those sort of people, so they're using it.
Right now, what's the possible market share of local manufacturers versus importers?
At the moment, um, INSEE and ourselves are at around 72%. and the rest are importers. The largest importer is Ultratech with about 18%.
Okay.
And the others are altogether about 9%.
Okay. Again, another question is on the earning sustainability. So he's asking, with the price revision, is it possible for Tokyo to maintain the earnings going forward?
Yeah. So now with the ability, like I mentioned before, the rock and the hard place, now we can adjust with cost increases when needed within reason. So in that case, we can. But then, as far as top line turnover and stuff, the biggest barrier is opening LCs. Establishing LCs is still difficulty. If we could establish LCs on time, we would easily be able to bump up our top line by 20% at least. So.
Okay, so that's it from the audience. Thank you very much, Mr. Praveen and Mr. Ajit, for speaking to us. I think that you have clarified most of the concerns the investor community had, and we believe like this is the starting point for the audience to get an understanding about the cement industry dynamics, and going forward we can build from this the initial meeting we had. Just before we wrap up this session, can you please give us the industry outlook from your point of view? Just a summary industry outlook.
I mean, it really depends on what kind of macroeconomic policy decisions are made. Forex and liquidity is still the crux of any kind of development here, or any kind of import operation for raw materials or anything like that. So until there's some kind of direction, whether it's floating the currency, going to IMF, whatever, we'd be able to actually plan around those kind of things. At the current stage, we aren't really we don't really know what kind of trend policy is going to take. So for that reason, there's not much we can say. We do see that interest rates historically have allowed for greater domestic and retail consumption, but also inflation has quelled that kind of consumption. When you look at salaries, for example, we saw that large salary bump nationally in 2015 with state sector, and then 2016 private sector outpacing it considerably. So that was the largest ever sort of salary bump, and it allowed for a lot more sort of affordability and purchasing power. If we can see that happen again in line with this inflation, if salaries and things were to adjust accordingly, things like that, I mean, it might allow for domestic consumption to continue to grow. But yeah, infrastructure is continuing from what we can see at this moment too.
Okay, so that's it, audience. I think we are going to wrap up the session. So thank you very much, Mr. Praveen and Mr. Ajit again for joining us on this call. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you, everybody.
You too.